Hello and welcome to today's episode of Courage Permission Slip. I am your host, Kia, and today I am so glad that I get to welcome a fellow coach, a fellow podcast host, Kim Meninger, to the show. And before we get started, I want to tell you just a little bit more about her. Kim is an executive coach and host of the Impostor Syndrome Files podcast. She is passionate about empowering women to become confident, visible, and influential leaders. Kim understands the challenges facing women in the workplace because she has experienced them herself. And now she strives to be the resource to women she wishes she had in her own corporate career. Welcome to the show, Kim.
Thank you so much, Kia. I am so grateful to be here today.
Awesome. And I'm really glad to have you. Kim and I had a very recent conversation. And so this is essentially just going to be a continuation of that. But Kim, what I would love to start off with, because, I didn't read this in your bio, but, you started your professional life in psychology. That was what you studied in college. And I remembered reading that you had no interest in working in corporate America. And then lo and behold, somehow you landed in the high-tech industry and worked in that area for 10 years. So I would just love to hear the decision-making process that you had to let yourself go through to make that decision before starting coaching.
Thank you so much for asking that. I did always think that I would become a clinical psychologist. From the time I was a child, I always thought I'm going to be a psychologist, at least from the time I knew what that meant. Mm-hmm. And so everything in my academic career was oriented in that direction. And I spent a couple of years after college getting some of the additional experience that I thought would help my application. And what I'm going to tell you two things. I'm going to tell you that the story I've been telling everyone for years is that I reached a point where I realized that I wasn't in a position to go into a Ph.D. program. And so I pivoted into the high-tech space. But if I'm being really honest with myself, I think that imposter syndrome derailed me because I had it drilled in my head for so long that clinical psychology Ph.D. programs were so competitive. And I think that I actually didn't go through because I was afraid I was going to not make it. And, it's hard for me to say that out loud. It's hard for me to tell you that because, I've just sort of convinced myself, no, it wasn't meant to be, right? It wasn't the right time. But I did think at the time that one of two things would happen. I would go into this new space and I would take my career in a whole new direction, or it would give me that extra nudge or that extra reinforcement that actually I should be applying for that Ph.D. program. And, when I got into the corporate world, I was really surprised that having a psychology background was actually helpful. I did find it as we talk about quote unquote soft skills, that part came very naturally to me. I was really good at relationship building and navigating some of the human side of the business. The technology, that was a whole other thing. But when I left my corporate career and I started coaching, I actually felt like I came full circle because the psychology piece for me was really about empowering other people, helping other people. And now in hindsight, not to be disrespectful to anybody in that field or to the population that field serves, but I feel so grateful as a coach to work with people who are healthy, who are motivated, who have so much great material to work with and just need some extra support moving that forward.
Yeah, I love that distinction because I don't think I shared this with you when we were in one of our several conversations. I actually a couple of times in my past, I wanted to be a psychologist. I wanted to be a therapist. I thought I wanted to study that, that would be my major. And, somewhere along the way, I think I had heard, oh, well, psychologists, they don't make that much money. Now, not knowing about PhDs and masters and all of that, right? But, I think that was like the first diversion tactic was, oh, they don't make a lot of money doing what they do. But then, so, I think I set that down. And when so my first career was marketing, right? And I was tired of that career. And I was thinking, okay, maybe now is the time to go back to school and become a therapist like I wanted to so many years ago. And then I had a conversation with a really good friend who used to be a therapist, who then became a coach. And she was like, trust me when I say you don't want to be a therapist, but I think you'd be great at coaching. And I'm really glad that I went that route because just as you kind of mentioned, I mean, it gives you so much flexibility in who you can serve and how you can serve them. So I am glad that I made that decision, but yeah, I mean, there was some like rigid thinking there for a minute, but something you said, Kim, that first of all, I really appreciate you making the public admission that you think imposter syndrome is what led you to not go into your PhD program. And just thinking about our recent conversation about, the importance of self-discovery and self-reflection. And I'm interested to know this revelation that you had of thinking that it was imposter syndrome. Do you feel like that was a relatively new admission, or is it something that has kind of just been in the back of your mind for a while that now you're like, okay, now is the time for me to admit this?
That's such a good question. I will say I do believe it was a relatively recent revelation. I think I had convinced myself for so long. I had been telling that same story over and over again, and I just came to believe it. And then I started to think about it, and I thought, here I am talking about imposter syndrome all the time, and I'm not even owning. I'll own other aspects of my imposter syndrome journey, but I thought this is a big one that I've been just breezing past, and I think I owe it to myself and others to be honest about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, just as we talked about the other day, being willing to admit the mistakes that you made, being willing to like let yourself even make that admission to yourself, have that realization with yourself. There's so much power in that, right? So even though you've been coaching for a while, you've been working with leaders at companies, and even though it's a new revelation, like when you have that sense of personal freedom, then that opens the door to so many other things, right? Because when the people, and this comes up on this show a lot, is that, there's so much power in transparency and honesty and vulnerability, right? And so when people hear you say, hey, this is a bad mistake that I made, right? Or this is a choice that didn't serve me, where I kept myself small. When you are willing to raise your hand and say, yeah, that didn't serve me, right? Then other people have the courage to then come forward and say, I made a career decision for that reason too.
I think that's such an important point. And I was thinking about this earlier too. I was talking with some coaching friends, and we were talking about how important it is to be vulnerable, because to really be of service to other people, they have to see us as being on the same journey, right? And I think that it gives, like you're saying, it gives permission. So many of us feel like we have to always put our best face on, right? There's no room for any vulnerability. And as soon as one person cracks, right? As soon as one person shares, then everyone feels like, oh, I can breathe. I can finally be honest. And so I think it's important that to my mission, certainly, and to, I think, our more collective mission, to just be really out there and honest with people that we certainly haven't had perfect careers. We've had lots of stumbles along our own paths, just like the people we serve.
Exactly. I want to build on that point that you talked about how important it is for coaches, right? To say, I'm on this journey too. And I will say, I use that exact verbiage with my clients, right? Like I'm not, because sometimes there is this power dynamic that happens in coaching, right? Like someone comes to you and you're like, or, a client will say or think, she's got all the answers, she knows better than me, etc. And it's just that we have extra training, right? But we're still human beings, we're still experiencing oftentimes what our clients are experiencing. So I always let people know I am on this journey with you. There are things that are going to come up in conversation that I'm uniquely equipped to deal with because I'm either dealing with it myself or I've previously dealt with it, and I can share those best practices wrapped in my coaching training as well, and the modality and those, those pathways to clarity and empowerment. So it's really important because that does take the temperature down and it allows people to open up and really allow themselves to be helped, I think.
Absolutely. I think you're right. I think it's hard to learn from someone. It's hard to feel safe with someone that you think is perfect.
Right. And as you know, and anyone who's listening to this, who's ever worked with a coach or a therapist, but I think especially a coach, because sometimes people feel like, oh, well, I just want to work on this, right? But as we all know, you can't work on your career and not take care of some of the like dark stuff in the closet, in your personal closet, right? Because that can impact your career decision, that can impact your career growth. So it is so important that people feel safe to share those things. And I have heard some things in my coaching sessions where it's like, wow, like this is such an honor and a privilege to have a window into someone's life, right? Like I've had clients that have explored getting divorced, in sessions. So, I mean, that's the degree to which people bring their whole selves when they feel safe, because that opens the door to so much more growth and opportunity, empowerment, enlightenment, etc.
I'm so glad you said that too, because I think the same thing. I have a process in the beginning of any engagement where I collect information about people and I ask some pretty personal questions. And I am always so humbled and so honored by the willingness of people to share so deeply of themselves. I do not take that for granted for 1 second. And you're absolutely right that openness creates so much more opportunity for that person to just raise their own self-awareness, grow in directions that they maybe, I mean, it's always so interesting to me. The person comes through the door for very specific reason. And then over the course of the journey, we move in so many other organic directions.
Yes. And I always let people know, like, this is not going to go the way that you think it's going to go without knowing anything. I'm not a fortune teller. Without knowing anything, this is not going to go the way that you think it's going to go. Right. And so I just encourage people to remain open to the experience and to just kind of let it take them where it needs to take them, because that's the experience that they probably need to have, and don't have any other relationships where that type of exploration can happen.
Exactly. And I sometimes find myself struggling with how to communicate that, because some people are very process oriented. They want to know on day one, what's our curriculum, right? Like, what are we going to do this day and this day? And it's just impossible, because so much of that is changing as you're changing, right? As the conversation is changing. And then the ability to be comfortable with being uncomfortable in the unknown is so important.
So important. And I do let people know that, so it's like, this is like the extended discovery call for anyone that's thinking of hiring us as their coach, right? Like, you're getting a real deep insight. But, I let people know that it's possible that it could get worse before it gets better, right? Like, I don't want to scare people away, but I also don't want people to be blindsided as we go through this, because the kind of questions that I ask, the kind of exercises that we do, the kind of exploration that we go through, they're going to uncover things that you have probably pushed down, have been stepping over for months, even years, right? And so I always just like to, and I say that at the beginning of a coaching partnership, but then I keep bringing it up throughout, because people get really surprised, right? Like, wow, like, didn't expect that, didn't know that's what was going on, right? But those aha moments are so important, because that's your fork in the road to make a change, to say, I can either keep doing the same thing and keep getting the same results, or I can make a different choice and start making those little bitty adjustments along the way to bring about those different results that they want.
Yes. And what you're making me think of is my analogy for that. It gets worse before it gets better.
Mm-hmm.
Is it's like cleaning your closet, right? Like, you have to rip everything out.
Yes.
And big mess, and there's a big pile of stuff, right? And then you get to decide, what do I put back?
Mm-hmm.
What do I get rid of?
Mm-hmm.
What do I maybe fold differently or store differently so that it better serves me? And then at the end, you've got like a much more organized closet.
Yes. But it sucked real bad before you got there. Oh my God. And I'm having like heebie-jeebies thinking about cleaning my own closet.
No.
Oh boy. Well, Kim, so we've already been talking so much about courage and permission and all these things, but I would love to, as a next step, would love to hear from you. When you think of the word courage, what comes forward for you? What does it mean to you?
That's such a good question, because I think sometimes we think of courage as being fearless, or that we have to be at a certain point first before we can be courageous. And I am a big believer, as somebody who has had a lifelong anxiety disorder. I am somebody who has been, I will openly say that I take medication for anxiety, that it is something that has ebbed and flowed throughout my life. So I've been extra sensitive to things like courage, because it would be so easy for me to just curl up in the fetal position and avoid anything scary. But I push myself, because I see it as a muscle. I see it as something that I'm not going to wait until I feel like I have courage. I'm not going to wait until the moment that I feel like, okay, it's safe to do this. I'm going to do it because it's scary, because it's meaningful to me, a meaningful kind of scary. And then I know that that's going to result in greater strength on the other side. I'm going to be more confident. I'm going to be more whatever it is that I'm striving for, if I can just push through that fear. So for me, courage is recognizing that you're about to jump into that deep end of the pool, and it's scary, but it's worth it.
Yeah. And I love what you said. I mean, so first of all, I love all that, because I too have an anxiety disorder. And so I'm not on medication anymore, but there are still very specific exercises that I have to go into when I feel the anxiety coming on, right? Like, it's not something that you're ever cured from. It's just something that you know how to manage better. And so, when I first learned that I was, when I was first diagnosed, I've been having anxiety attacks for years, but when I was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, I didn't know the signs of when it was coming on. And so now I do, like, I can feel it. And sometimes I can catch it before it spirals. Sometimes I don't, though, right? Because of that, perfectionist type A life, that we've talked about. And so sometimes I'm not able to stop it. I'm still wanting to push through. But so first I want to honor you in sharing that you do have that anxiety disorder. But what I love what you said about, you can't wait until you're fully courageous, right? You can't wait until you're like, your courage reserves are all the way filled up, because it is about pushing through those uncomfortable feelings in service of what you know is bigger and better on the other side. And something you said about how confidence gets built up once you do that, it reminds me of this quote that I heard someone say. Danny Shapiro said the quote, but Debbie Millman was talking about it in an interview that she was doing. And the quote was that confidence is overrated, right? Like, because confidence is built up over the process of actually taking steps, right? And building competence and, kind of like building up that thicker skin, right? But you have to have courage first. You have to be willing to say, well, this is probably going to hurt. I don't know how this is going to go, right? But I know that what I could get from the other side is more important than where I am right now and how it feels right now. So I love that you said that confidence comes after you've taken that step of jumping into the deep end of the pool.
Thank you. And, I think about this a lot, especially probably because of my anxiety disorder, but also because I like to think about a lot of what we're talking about in terms of just the things that get in our way as very instinctive human responses to scary things, right? Like we just all have that part of our brain that's always on alert for danger. And so I think that we are very consistently going to experience fear when there's something unknown or when there's, a risk that we're taking. And so recognizing that that's always going to happen, rather than try to remove that fear, resist it. It's just part of being a human. What you're talking about is exactly how I think about it, is what's bigger than the fear, right?
Yes.
What is more important to me than protecting myself from whatever I'm afraid of? And when we can really understand what that thing is, that's what pushes us. That's what gives us that extra tips the balance in such a way that we can get through that fear.
Yeah. Love that so much. So how did giving yourself permission to make a certain decision, or any decision, right? How did giving yourself permission to be courageous lead you to where you are or what you're doing right now?
Oh, so my story around this is that when I was working in corporate America, I thought that was, once I was there for a while, that was my destiny. I thought, I'm just going to continue to grow and I'm going to work. And I grew up with a single mom who always told me, never depend on a man for your financial security, right? Like, I mean, you can hear there's some bitterness in there, but she thought she was being practical, right? And, make sure you're well educated and you can take care of yourself. And so when my husband and I met, I was working full time in corporation. I had a very secure job. I had my first child at a time when I was not happy with the direction my company was taking. I was really starting, you reach those crossroads where you have more of that, what am I meant to do in my life kinds of thoughts. And I remember having this conversation with my husband about not wanting to go back to that job that I had. And he's like, we can afford it. Take some time off. Just don't make any decisions right now. And I remember that for me, that took a lot of courage, because it just flew directly in the face of what I had, I was like, oh my, you mean I'm going to use your money to buy stuff? Or, I was like, you mean I have to, you're going to provide for me? It was so basic to how I was living my life that I thought, I don't know if I can do this. And then he was so incredibly supportive, and it wasn't, obviously we were partners in the process. This was all my own stuff that I was bringing into it, but that allowed me to be really thoughtful about where I could add value and what I was meant to do. And when I had some space to finally reflect and ask myself some of the bigger questions that we're probably asking our clients all the time, I thought, when was I most satisfied in my career? Like, when did I feel like I was actually doing something that was in alignment with my strengths and my values. When was I last happy with my work? And when I finally reached a point where I thought, I want to help other people. I want to be the resource to other people that I didn't feel like I had. That's when it all came together. And had I not had, courage and the support of my husband to get me to that point, I certainly would not be where I am today.
So first of all, I appreciate that. And I, because I didn't get married until I was later age. And so for so long, I provided for myself, right? Like I made all my decisions. I didn't have to ask anyone else's opinion. I was just like, oh, I want to spend that money. I'm going to spend that money, right? And so I'm interested to hear from you, if you're willing to dig into this a little bit, Kim, is like, so that was your first permission slip that you had to give yourself of like, okay, I'm gonna let my husband bolster me up, right? While I do this exploration, which is so important, right? Like what a privilege that is to be able to do that, right? Because we know that many people, when they discover that a job or a career path doesn't work for them, or if they've been laid off, we know that many times people do not have that luxury to just kind of like, not saying that you were luxuriating, but to really like take a really deliberate, intentional time to do that exploration. But for you, so your husband was like, hey, like we can afford it. And then so you let yourself lean in on that. Did you find yourself as you were going through this time away to do this exploration, did you have moments where you felt like, I just need to hurry up and get this figured out, right? So that I can start making my own money again. Did that come up, and how did you deal with that?
Yeah. And if I'm being honest, I think I still deal with it. And what's interesting is I've been doing this for about 10 years now. I'll tell you the twist. My husband just moved to part-time. So now I'm the breadwinner in the family. And, I think that has certainly, that whole dynamic has dictated the seriousness with which I've approached my business, because I have some friends who have gone into business or have taken an entrepreneurial path because they've wanted more flexibility to be available to their families, and maybe it's more like a side hustle while they're raising their kids, or they don't necessarily think of it as their career, and not to disparage how they think about it, but more so I had this very strong need to prove that I was not wasting time, that I was not, that this wasn't just a hobby, that I felt like I need to prove that it was a good decision to quit my corporate job and that I can actually do this and make a living doing it. And that, I've been very successful in my business, but I've also sacrificed a lot of my personal time. And I definitely, I hustle all the time, right? It's like always, my husband will say things to me like, you don't have to work that hard. Like, why are you working so hard? And part of it is I love what I do, but part of it is I think that there is still this part of me that feels like I need to show up this way, or I'm letting myself down, or I'm letting the family down. Something's going on there.
We could have a whole podcast conversation just on this piece alone about the need to prove something, right? To not only prove to yourself, but to prove to this, generalized other, right? Whether it be your spouse or your extended family, friends, society at large, right? Like there's so much that's just like layered into that especially when you're an entrepreneur, right? Like there are plenty, like, yes, this is what happens for people that are working, corporate jobs for other people, of this, like, wanting a certain title, right? Because that looks like I've made it, right? All of this hard work has paid off, right? But for us, like the risk of leaving guaranteed income, guaranteed benefits, right? To this thing that feeds our soul and helps other people, but like anything else, could go away in an instant, right? Someone could say, oh, you know what? We lost our budget, or, oh, my income is not looking great this month. I'm going to need to pause, right? Like that one decision, one way or the other. And you can be like, oh, okay, well, guess I'm going to be hustling a little bit more this month. Yeah. So, oh boy, I feel that and I get that. So thank you for letting me dig into that just a teensy bit. So Kim, when you think about all of this, you think about all the places where you have given yourself permission and how hard you're working. What fears do you notice pop up for you?
It's a really good question. I think I'm always afraid of over promising and under delivering.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I always want to say yes to any opportunity that comes my way. I think part of it is, I think it's all connected, right? Part of it is that I want to prove myself. Part of it is this practice that I've built around managing my anxiety of saying yes before my brain says no. And then but I also don't want to overstretch myself. And so I think I'm always worried that, am I actually able to do what I say I can do?
Kim, it's like you're in my head, right? Like yes, I hear that. I empathize with that. That is real. And so when you notice that fear pop up, right? Of, I want to say yes, my heart wants to say yes. My brain is like, what are you doing? Right? Like, what's going on? How do you manage that fear when it comes up?
So part of it is I really try to zoom out and consider the larger context. And this is something that I often recommend as a strategy for imposter syndrome management and things like that too, is that we get so laser focused on what's unique about this very moment that we're in. And we forget that while this situation may be somewhat different, it's no different in the whole scheme of things than anything else that we have done along the way. That where we are right now is just one small incremental step further than where we were yesterday or last hour, whatever the case may be. And that allows me to keep it in perspective and remind myself, oh, okay, I have tools that I can use to help me through this. I can effectively manage this situation. And one thing that I'll say, just because this is on my mind right now, is I had this very specific situation where I was invited to do a workshop on a particular topic, and the scope started to expand, and I started to have heart palpitations and think, oh no, I can't do this. I actually invited a colleague in with me, and I said, this is the first time I've ever actually done that. And I thought, you know what? Asking for help is so powerful. Not that feeling that I don't have to do everything myself. It just, the weight lifted off of my shoulders. So I think there's a certain part that I know I remind myself that I know I can handle it because I've been here before, and this is doable, but also just leveraging our resources, not putting so much pressure on ourselves.
Yeah. And that goes to that vulnerability conversation that we were having a little while ago, of you could have easily just been like, oh, okay, I got to figure out how to do this. Like, I've said yes, I've committed to this. I've got to get this figured out. Right. And there is benefit to doing that, right? Because it adds to your proof folder that, hey, I didn't know what I was doing when I said yes to this, and it came out great, right? And you know that anything that maybe didn't work out so well, you learn from that, right? If you allow yourself to. But also there is huge benefit, not only energetically, but, from a mental health perspective, of bringing someone in, right? To help lighten the load a little bit and lighten the stress, knowing that, okay, I don't have to do this all by myself, right? I have resources that can at least advise me, right? As opposed to me trying to figure out every single detail by myself. So there's a lot of strength and power in that level of vulnerability to say, hey, I've got to do this thing, not really feeling great. Are you willing to help in any way? Right.
Exactly. And you're right that normally my path would be, oh, it's a learning opportunity. I'm just going to do it myself, and I'm going to, I'll freak out along the way, but I'll get there and it'll go fine. But I think there's just as much to learn from recognizing where your lane ends and where someone else's begins. And even, in this particular case, I was fortunate enough to have a colleague with this expertise, and the timeline worked out and everything. But I think even just smaller asks, like feel the same pressure to prove myself at home as a mom. And sometimes just saying to my husband something like, hey, do you mind being the one to do this time around?
Yeah.
And he never, he'll never balk at that. It's like, I don't have to always be the one. I can, it's okay to ask for help.
Yes. Ugh. I relate on all fronts. So Kim, where, as you continue moving forward in your business and growing and building teams, where are you still wanting to give yourself permission to be courageous?
I think that I still, as much as I believe in the value of what I do, and have a great track record of doing it, I still struggle sometimes with putting myself out there as an expert, or sharing more of what I know with a broader audience. I still think that I have my own bouts of imposter syndrome where I think, who am I to, right? I definitely find myself falling into the social comparison trap of like, this person's doing this so much better than I am, or, I have to get on this bandwagon. Like I was joking the other day about how I had this moment where I'm like, I'm not on TikTok, right? Like I'm not on TikTok, like, and just kind of taming some of those very instinctive impulses and reminding myself, you're doing this, you're doing it your way. You don't have to do it the same way that everybody else does. Not getting hung up on the messages that are saying like, oh, you should be talking about yourself this way, or you should be promoting yourself over here, and just being my own authentic self.
Because that struggle, that fear of putting yourself out there, right? I mean, we hear that from our clients, right? Like we hear this from so many people of, that is such a huge fear for people, or hurdle. And so how do you, obviously doing that recognition of, do I really need to be on TikTok, right? Like the more you expand yourself, right? Like the more you dilute your energy, right? And your expertise. And so how do you kind of like gather yourself to keep putting yourself out there, right? Because you talked about it a little while ago about how you're always hustling, right? Which means, when you're reaching out to people to, create new clients, whether it be one-on-one, or if you're working for a company, or working with a company, like how do you push through that?
Yeah, I think it's hard. I think it's never easy to experience any kind of rejection, or, it's a different ballgame when you're an entrepreneur, because you feel like you're selling yourself. And that's a really vulnerable, because when someone doesn't buy your product, they're not buying you, right? So it's very personal.
Yes.
I think that what has helped me, and it's still a work in progress, but what has helped me is to think of it more so as I offer a solution to a certain set of problems, or I'm here to address certain needs. And if you don't have those needs, or if I'm not the best resource to help you address those needs, that's not about me. That's not about, that's not a personal rejection. It just means that it's not the right time, or it's not the right fit. And so that changing that narrative in my brain has made it a lot easier for me to navigate some of this discomfort that comes with putting yourself out there.
Yeah, again, that especially because while we have a service or a product that we're putting out there, it still comes from us, right? Like it originates from us, right? And so being able to separate that it isn't personal, right? It's just, as you said perfectly, it's either not the right time or it's not the right solution for the exact issue, challenge, problem that that person or that company is having at this point in time. And so just like being willing to say, okay, well, on to the next, right? But I do that sometimes that comes up for me, right? When I'm putting myself out there, when I'm, reaching out to someone to say, hey, like I noticed that you engage with this, and then you say, hey, like, what other needs you have? And maybe there's something that I can do to help. And while I feel really passionately about what it is that I'm bringing to the table and, what their specific issue is, I have to remember that, but if they say no, it's not about me, right? Because it's like, they don't even know me, right? So, but it's so easy because we put so much of ourselves into what we do. So much of our product is predicated on our personal experience, right? And how we've grown and developed over the years.
I agree with you. And I think that this applies to women in the workplace too, because I think sometimes we over personalize our work and even idea sharing. So if I'm in a meeting and I share an idea and it doesn't land as well, or it's not the idea that's adopted, or maybe somebody says, no, we've tried that before. It's like such a personal attack. It feels so, there's such a sting. And then maybe we don't share the next. And I think it's so important to be able to separate out the value of sharing, because now you've done your part, right? You have taken that risk, you've shared, and you don't know when that might be a good idea at another time, or you don't know that it might not be the jumping off point for something else. And so I think, just like we've been talking about throughout, we have to recognize where we're over protecting ourselves, because really at the end of the day, no matter what you do, it's always about being of greatest service. And if you're holding yourself back, if you're holding back your real value, you are not showing up in a way that allows other people to take advantage of.
Right. Well, and so just building on that about what you were saying about people being afraid to share ideas in the workplace, right? Like, as you said, not only could that be a jumping off point for, really taking on that, that improv process of yes and, right? So maybe it's not that exact thing, but there's something there. So let's take that, and how else could that work, right? So there's that piece, but also, again, like we were saying earlier, when people, let's say you are in that meeting, right? And it's as a team, as an organization, you are tasked with solving an issue, whether it be a business issue or really acute, team issue, organizational issue. By you having the courage to say, hey, this is something that feels like it might work, by you doing that and putting it out there, kind of taking that messy action, that gives other people in the room permission, courage to say, oh, well, if she put herself out there, then at the very least, I can throw out the idea that I've been, complaining about in the hallways, right? And so that adds diversity of thought. And that, then you start to create this culture of safety, right? Of psychological safety, when first leaders have to be open to that, right? They have to be open to the messy action because of what that opens the door to, right? But it also creates that culture of, hey, we want to hear different perspectives, different lived experiences, because we can't keep doing things the way that we've always done them, right? And so if people aren't willing to share those ideas, right, to say, hey, what about this? Then you're not going to be able to creatively solve an issue.
Exactly. And I think that's a perfect example of what we were talking about a while ago when we were saying what's bigger than the fear, because I think sometimes what happens is we get so attached to the very specific outcome and we lose sight of the bigger picture. And you're absolutely right. We need to understand, everyone needs to understand the safety factor in your own culture. But generally speaking, I think each one of us has an opportunity to really think not just about our own ego and protecting ourselves, but also leading by example. And my willingness to be vulnerable makes it safe and possible for other people to share as well. And that's how we get to a better place.
Right. And so one other add that I'm going to make to that, because, you and I work with leaders so much, is, the bigger leader in the room, right? The person that is kind of has charge over that whole team. It is important for you as a leader to be willing to raise your hand, to be humble, to have humility, to say where maybe you've made a mistake, right? Or where you weren't thinking broadly, right? Or where you weren't creating a safe, cooperative, collaborative environment, right? It can't always be and I don't want to say like the people at the lower levels, right? But, individual contributors, it can't always be the people at the middle management and lower levels to be always the ones that are being courageous and sticking their necks out, right? People at the top who have some say over the systemic issues that are happening at an organization, they have to be willing to say, you know what, I'm going to run this up the flagpole, right? I'm going to take this and put my neck out to say, hey, this isn't working for us. This is what I'm going to do, right? Asking for forgiveness instead of permission, right? But so it's important that there is this, this two-way street of who's putting their neck out, right? It can't always be the people at the middle and lower levels doing that, because that is what creates that feeling of burnout, that creates that feeling of disengagement, which is what has made way for, the great resignation that we're all like in the throes of right now. So it's really important that it works in all directions, that being courageous piece.
I'm so glad you said that too, because I think sometimes we have these conversations about how do we get to these better places that feel so out of reach. We talk about the vision of a more inclusive workplace. We talk about building greater psychological safety, and it always feels like it's someone else's job to do that.
Yeah.
And it really is something that we can all look in the mirror and ask ourselves, how am I showing up? Am I acting from a place of, leading by example, or am I being the change I want to see? Yeah. And you're absolutely right. It needs to happen all the way up and down. So for anyone listening who has that kind of influence, and that's a great place to start.
Yes. 1000%. Oh, so good. So as a final note, Kim, and we've talked about this, you've shared so many gems and strategies along the way. But for the person who is listening right now, whether they're a leader, whether they're an individual contributor, whether they're just, kind of floating in the career pivot space, whoever that person is that is listening to this, that has a goal or a dream or a vision on their heart, but the fear of taking a step is much bigger than the dream or the goal or the vision. What is your guidance to that person in order to move forward?
So my approach, going back to how I manage this and how I help other people manage this, is that the fear is often so big and difficult to wrap our arms around that despite our best intentions, it's really hard to get it to a level where we can push through it. So one thing that I recommend is, when you feel that fear, when you feel that sense of anxiety, is to actually sit with it and ask yourself questions like, what am I actually afraid of? Very, very specifically. And I think you and I talked about this in our previous conversation too, right? Because until you can get it to an actionable level, you can't really solve that problem. So I have this framework that I like to use, which is feel the anxiety, shift to analysis, right? Like, what am I feeling and why? What is this telling me? And then what's the action I can take?
Yeah.
So it might be something as small as, I just need to have another conversation with someone where I get more information, or, maybe I can do some training that makes me feel like I'm more prepared for this. It can be very small action, but I think something that makes us feel like we're making forward progress and we're in the driver's seat. We're not letting that anxiety take over.
I so appreciate you sharing that and sharing that step, and really clarifying that it can be something as small as taking a step to get more information, whether that be Googling, whether that be reaching out and sending an email to someone, or, watching a YouTube video, right? But knowing that when you have when you do that examination of the fear and then that analysis, it doesn't mean that you've got to flip tables, right? It doesn't mean that you've immediately got to change everything, right? Like, every big change starts with small action, right? So just take one or two little steps forward, and then that gives your subconscious signs that, okay, I didn't die. I didn't get hurt because I sent an email, right? And I think the other piece is, just like you were saying, of getting outside of our ego, getting outside of our head, and remembering that at their heart, people really do want to help, right?
Yes.
Like, people do want to help and want to support and want to cheer people on. And so, but they can't do that if you're contracted, right? They can't do that if you're just like, well, okay, well, I'm just going to try to figure this out, and I guess I'll suffer in silence, right? People can't do that if they don't know that you need support.
Yes, that's such a good point too. And so what I always think about what Adam Grant says, which is that we feel more connected to the people we help than the people who help us. And that actually helps. I think it's helpful to think of it that way, because so often we think that we're taking and not giving, but giving an opportunity to someone to help you is a powerful gift, because we all know what it feels like to be of service to someone else.
Yes.
And so if it helps anybody to think about it that way, it's a good motivation.
Well, and we've heard, a lot of mental health practitioners and experts say that one of the best ways, like, if you are feeling completely low vibe, feeling down on yourself, one of the best things that you can do is to help someone else, right? Because you just get out of your own way, get out of your own little mess, right? Get out of your own little pity party and reach out to someone else, whether that's, paying someone's order at Starbucks, or, you see a post in, a group that you're in of someone saying, hey, I need help with this, and send that person an email, right? Like, that can make a huge difference in the way that you feel about yourself and what it is that you're trying to do.
You're right. And I think too that having some type of gratitude practice, or some type of practice of reminding yourself of what's going well. And so my twist on the gratitude practice, because I think women are much better at giving credit to others than we are to ourselves, is to track what we're grateful for, but to also ask ourselves, what role did I play in achieving that outcome? Right.
Yes.
I wouldn't recommend that to somebody who's, very pompous, but I think for women, we need to take that extra step to remind ourselves that I'm playing an active role and that I have a right to take credit for the things that I'm doing too. And that also restores some of our confidence. It gives us that sense of,
Yes.
oh, I can do this.
And oh, by the way, that practice is great to do for when you're getting ready to update your resume, start interviewing and outreaching for jobs, because now you've got some proof that you do know what you're doing, right? So when those imposter feelings start coming up and bubbling to the surface, you can go back to your list and say, oh, but actually, here's what I have done and it's worked out. Right. So that gift that you just shared, Kim, is the gift that will give infinitely if you do it.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
Well, Kim, this has been, as I knew it would be, this has been such a wonderful and enjoyable and rich conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and guidance here today.
Oh my goodness, Kia, thank you so much. I know I could talk to you all day.
Yes.
I'm so grateful for this opportunity and so hopeful that others will benefit from what we've talked about today.
I know they will. I know they will. So, Kim, if people want to get in touch with you and learn more about you, where can they find out about you?
So I'm most active on LinkedIn, and you can find me at Kim Meninger. And my podcast, once again, is the Impostor Syndrome Files. Stay tuned for my interview with Kia. You'll get a chance to hear the other half of our conversation.
Amazing. And I will include all of this in the show notes so that people can easily connect with you. Again, thank you so much, Kim. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for following along today and listening to this episode of Courage Permission Slip. If you have found us on YouTube, please make sure that you like and subscribe so that you can be alerted when new episodes are available. And if you are listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, please be sure to rate and review so that it's easier for people to find and enjoy this content as well. Until the next time, please make sure you're making your dreams bigger and more important than your fears. And we will see you on the next episode of Courage Permission Slip. Bye.